Hello everyone, my name is Vicki and I'm part of the IX Stitch group. The other individual is my husband, and he won't be joining me for this little short thing because, well, he doesn't stitch the way that I do. I have recently been seeing a lot of discussion about sewing in hand, stitching in hand, and using the sewing method. And I had mentioned to some individuals how I stitch, which is a little different than most people because no one ever really showed me how to do it. I always stitched on a hoop, and the first time I went to a needlework shop, the person who owned it suggested that I stitch this mirabilia in hand using the sewing method, and because I didn't know how to do it, I only knew how to use a little hoop, and I was kind of confused by how big this was. And I thought, well, that's interesting, and I thought, okay, I can do that. I know how to sew by hand. In fact, I prefer it. And the reason I preferred it was because the first real craft I had learned was when I was in, I guess I was in 6th grade. And the school that I was at had a relationship with an orphanage that was in Mexico. And all the different classes would do different things to create items for the kids in the orphanage. And what my class did was we learned to hand sew and make dolls and to make their clothes. I mean, we were a class of, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 kids. You couldn't have sewing machines. At that age, I don't think I'd want to have kids deal with it because you'd probably sew your fingers. But they taught us how to sew very fine seams in hand. And that's where I learned to sew. And for years, and even today, if I'm going to repair a seam or fix a zipper or something like that, I'll do it by hand rather than by machine, because I can do just as strong a fix and quicker. I have to unpack my machine. Well, currently I can't get to my machine anyway, but it's just what I prefer. So when I went home that day and decided to try and stitch, I picked up the linen, which was maybe the second time I had ever stitched on linen. And I tried to figure out how to sew. In hand was unusual. I liked the feel of it, but how to sew. And what I did was, rather than go forward, like everybody else does in this world, it looks like, from the front, face up and down, to me it was more natural to turn the fabric to the side and sew, just like I did when I was a little girl with those seams. And so what I learned to do, just because it worked for me, was to sew sideways. My pattern's straight. I still look at it straight, but somehow in my brain I convert it and go sideways. I'm sure that's not the way for most people to stitch, but hey, maybe there's some other strange people out there like me. If you learn to sew by hand, this might make more sense. And so I promised the same individuals who asked me about it that I would show a short video of how I do it. And so we'll go to that part right now. Hello, as I mentioned in the earlier part of this video, I am showing an example of how I stitch in hand using the sewing method. And mine is a little bit sideways, well, sideways. I look at the chart normally, up and down, but I convert it to a sideways stitch because of the way I learned to stitch. In this example, I'm using He Is Risen by Diane Williams of Little House Needleworks. Now, this is available as a separate chart, but I printed this off from my Just Cross Stitch DVD. The DVD is 2001 through 2010, and this chart is in the, let's see, I've got it, March, April 2010 edition. So if you happen to have that magazine, then you'll actually have this chart also. I'm using a 24 needle. Previously, before I developed my lung issues, I would have used a 26, a 26 on a 32 count linen, which is what this is. But since then, I prefer the larger needle. It makes a larger hole. It cuts down the friction on the thread, and so it doesn't degrade as quick, and it doesn't throw the fibers and the microfibers into the air, or at least not as much. I stitch using a mask, so I may sound a little bit muffled, and I apologize for that, but that is the way I have to stitch. And I also stitch without my glasses on because, as it turns out, I can see a whole lot better that way. Now, some people use a threader, and I do with the smaller needles, and I do with metallics. Some people lick, but I don't. I bend my thread, two strands of it, or one strand, depending, over the side of the needle, turn the needle to face, and then push it through. If it doesn't go through one side, I flip the needle over and go through the other side, because sometimes the needles are bigger. And in fact, generally, the little needle heads here, the holes, are bigger on one side than the other because they're stamped in. Okay, so in this case, I'm using 2 threads. As I said, a 32 count linen. This was a white Belfast that's been overdyed by my husband, Doug. And we don't name, he's just started doing it. He's talked and thought about it for many years. And he's jumping in with both feet, but he hasn't named him. Especially since he and I are the only ones that plan to be the recipients of it. Although he's talking about dyeing fabric for my daughter and t-shirts for the grandkids and stuff like that. Anyway, so I just anchored that. I use the loop method, which means I've doubled the thread over. One end is got the loop, the other's got the 2 cut. Put it through, and on the back, I catch the loop, and that's what anchors my thread. Some people do it from the front, but I like to keep an eye on what's going on the back of my fabric. So I'm doing the second leg on these. I've already come through and done the first, but I'll do another row at least to show you how both are done. But this is my second leg. So I'm going back, and just like I do when I'm using a Q-snap, my first leg is from the left bottom to the right top, and then my second leg is from the right bottom to the left top. So even in hand, sideways, I do it the same way. The only time it's difficult for me is when I'm doing a stitch up. If I'm going back and forth or down, I can stitch exactly like this from the side. Oh, by the way, this is me. As I skip a stitch, I just bring it up to where I need to start. I go under that one stitch and just keep going. And when I am going upwards, for some reason, it doesn't work for me to try and stitch sideways going towards my hand. That angle is weird for me. That's the only time when I turn my thing around and I stitch in hand in the normal fashion, I guess is how you would say. From what I understand from a lot of hand sewers, that they have to turn their work at certain points while they're stitching. Sometimes they can stitch this way, but they can't stitch that way, so, or vice versa. Anyway, this is a much faster method for me than when I use a Q-snap or use a scroll frame, and I've used all those things, and I enjoy them. Although right now, the angle with a stand and a scroll frame is an angle that I can't really stitch, and holding a Q-snap and doing the jabbing method up and down is really hard on my back, and that's because I still have muscle spasms and nerve pain from the shingles I developed in October of 2018. Okay, so for this next strand, I am going back one. Now, if I was going to, now this is something else I do. When it gets tangled or twisted, I let my needle thing. If I was going straight down, I would just go down like that. I will go over one, either direction. Anything more than that, I actually stitch differently. Now in this case, you'll see this is me doing the first leg. So from the bottom right to the upper left, and then just keep stitching. And that's pretty much how it is. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can show you. Well, I could show you what the other thing is that I do, but I don't have an example of it right now. If it was more than two, what I'd do is I'd drop down. If I was going over two this way, I'd do full cross stitches, and then I'd pick it up, and I'd do the half stitches so that I wasn't dragging my thread around. And going the other way, I would do the same thing, and I would just go backwards and do a full cross stitch. Because it's easy to do a full cross stitch, so I'll just go ahead and do one, just as an example. See, you can do that from the top. You don't need to do anything special. You just make your stitch and continue on. So when I go backwards, I'll just skip that stitch. And that's pretty well what it is. And I hope this has been interesting, if not informative. But for those of you who may be having problems with the sewing method, it's another way to try. You know, I'm probably doing it totally wrong, but that's okay. They say there's no cross stitch police, and that's good, because I probably would be committing a lot of crimes. I learned on my own from a Gloria and Pat booklet. It had examples of maybe 3 things. And it didn't even include an example of back stitch. So my initial back stitches were pretty atrocious. And I dragged things around all over the place. And I still have problems with back stitch. I really don't know how to anchor them. I mean, I know how to do a pin stitch for a stitch, but what in the world do you do for a back stitch? Okay, this is going to be one short. I don't actually count when I get to these lines. What I do is I note where I am in comparison with the line above. So I didn't go blah, 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 count, count, count. I just go over here and I go one short. And that's how I do my counting. And I do gridding, not really so much with the counting. The counting is not the big thing for me. It's actually visually seeing where the threads are. I lack depth perception. And actually both of my daughters too. So I don't know if it's a gene that's carried in families, perhaps genetic. But it makes a difference in how you see the threads and how you see the holes and your ability to keep track of where you are. So for me, this works. Anyway, as I said, I think that's it. I might as well stop here. I could show you another thread, but that would just make this longer and for no purpose. When I get back here, what I'll do is, instead of coming up in this hole, I'll just come up in the next one and just keep going. It's very fast, although right now I'm considerably slower than I was. I still have to be very careful with how I move and stuff. But I think for people who do try the sewing method, whether they do it this orientation or this or whatever it takes, you're going to find that it's faster. You'll probably find that your stitches are not quite as even, that your tension isn't as good. But for me, that's offset not by just the speed, which is a fun thing, but also by being able to feel my fabric in hand and be able, the portability of it, and just, I don't know, I just really enjoy having it in my hands. It's important, of course, when you're hand stitching to keep your hands very clean. You know, I don't use any lotion. I wait until my stitching session is over and then I put my lotion on. But as I said, I hope this has been interesting. Goodbye for now.